What is up, everybody? Hazeblade here, and today we're going to be taking a look at how to play Samuel in the Resident Evil Resistance open beta. Now, I just want to address this right now and get the air clear. Yes, he is definitely a Chad. The community has already established this before the game is even fully released, so don't be surprised if I call him Chad or Samuel interchangeably, because he is absolutely a Chad. But I digress. What we're going to be talking about today is some more universal strategy. Of course, for this being a series of videos on how to play all of the survivors, we're going to be talking a little bit more about that, as well as how Samuel can specifically contribute his abilities and skills to benefit your team. So Samuel is a melee DPS. He primarily excels at dealing damage up close. You'll actually be able to determine that very quickly just by taking a look at his primary abilities. One of them is a punch, and the other one is a punch. So one of them is just a little bit more involved than the other. So by using his primary skill, or his personal skill, you actually can get a pretty significant movement speed bonus, which in this particular video, I don't really exploit that too much, because as much as I like glitches and exploits better than the next person, being a speedrunner myself, I did want to at least give this mastermind somewhat of a chance, knowing that we were probably going to win anyway, and we did. So with Samuel, he has two primary abilities. So his personal skill is that he can do a punch. It does a decent amount of damage. It can stagger enemies. Very similar to Tyrone's kick. It has some benefit in that the cooldown is actually reset when you don't hit anything. So you actually get kind of a like bad luck protection, I guess, against it. However, again, with it being kind of exploited and stuff like that, I would definitely expect that movement speed bonus element of it to be patched relatively soon, so that way there's not any significant advantage to playing Samuel and being able to cheese mechanics and things like that. So outside of that, he also has his fever ability, which the fever ability is kind of a really well-rounded skill for melee, in that he doesn't need a melee weapon, because his whole background story is that he was a boxer and whatnot. So he can actually just whoop out his fists and start doing some pretty crazy damage, which throughout this run, I don't use that skill a ton. Personally, Samuel's not my favorite character of the bunch, but it does have its uses. Specifically, if you run out of repair kits in the third phase and you have to resort to using your fists to break the biocores. So let's continue talking about universal strategy. So as we know from the beginning of the series with January and Valerie's videos, you really want to get through that first section as quickly as possible, identifying the presets, knowing where the key locations are, and being able to just briskly get through that section. Now, once you save up and you start acquiring umbrella credits, which, by the way, one thing on umbrella credits that's important to know, umbrella credits are actually evenly split amongst your team. So when one person picks up umbrella credits, those credits are actually split amongst the remaining 3 survivors. So what I typically do when I play is, I'm definitely a hoarder when it comes to umbrella credits, but that enables the remainder of my team to be able to continue pursuing the objective. But with me taking that responsibility, I can make sure that we have enough money once we get into the second and third phase to be able to buy grenades and shotguns and magnums and sledgehammers and all the things that we need in order to complete those objectives. So it's very, very important that you do not ignore the umbrella credits. Otherwise, you're going to have a very tough time having the weapons and equipment that you need in order to progress through the second and third part of the level. Now, it's very important to remember that we are playing as a melee DPS as Samuel, as well as Tyrone. So when it comes to prioritizing what your inventory looks like, it's best to avoid ranged weapons like handguns and shotguns and machine guns if you have the ability to prioritize other items. For example, enhancement sprays, other healing items, things that are going to prove to be more useful. So once you've got those things out of the way, specifically once you're looking towards like the second half of the second phase, provided that you die and then you have to run back to the item box, or at the beginning of the third phase, what you can then do is say, okay, I have X amount of available inventory spaces. I've got a sledgehammer, I've got 3 repair kits. What else do I need to really fill out this inventory? So as a melee DPS, that shotgun that you might have your eye on, or that magnum, that is the final priority. That is not your #1 priority. Far too often do I see many melee DPS survivors trying to sport a shotgun at the very beginning of the game when they haven't already taken care of the other priorities. So in this case, I do have a 2x4 and a shotgun. However, more often than not, in this case, I decided to do something a little bit different, but more often than not, I'm actually prioritizing the use of the 2x4, knowing that Chad, aka Samuel, and Tyrone are going to be more effective with those things. And then once I get to phase 3, provided that it's an option and I have the inventory space for it, that may be a time when I start to prioritize using ranged weapons. Now, one thing that's actually really cool about the Magnum is that you can actually snipe the biocores from a distance, and it still does pretty considerable damage at range. So in the event that you get split up from the survivors and they're on the top floor working on a biocore and you're still on the bottom level and can't get up there, whether it be that the mastermind raised the lift on you and you're waiting for it to come down and whatnot, you can use that Magnum at range to be able to make some pretty significant moves and help progress through that stage. But as I mentioned before, it is still pretty important to take a look at your inventory and understand what your priorities are. Those priorities are a solid melee weapon, and honestly, you can pretty much not even worry about the steel bat, because once you get to phase 3, you can buy the sledgehammer. But if you get the right luck, you can actually buy the sledgehammer at the beginning of stage 2, and that is your number 1 priority. Number 2 priority is repair kits. You do not want that sledgehammer to break, because it is incredibly expensive to replace that if you don't have a repair kit in its place. When you look at the actual cost of a repair kit versus the cost of a brand new sledgehammer, you'll notice that it is significantly cheaper to just make sure that you're stocked up on repair kits, especially considering that they're a fraction of the cost and you can stack 3 of them in one inventory space before it starts consuming another one. So those are your top 2 priorities. And then at that point, if you've got 2 inventory spaces occupied there, of course you have 6 remaining, that's when you start to think about grenades. Grenades are definitely going to be in the top 3 priorities, and that doesn't matter what character you are. Having grenades to be able to combat the ultimate skills that the mastermind uses is incredibly important to make sure that when you do encounter those obstacles, you're able to consistently deliver and follow up with those situations as they arise and come out of that on top. So those are a couple different things specifically with universal strategy, but also how that strategy applies to your specific character. Top 3 priorities there. Now, once you've got those out of the way, hypothetically, if you have flash and frag grenades, you really only have 4 inventory spaces left. Ideally, you're going to want some healing items in there, either a couple first aid sprays if you happen to find them around the level. Otherwise, if you run into a situation where you have 3 green herbs and you're stockpiling those, that's another opportunity to occupy that. And at that point, you've got 2 or 3 inventory spaces left over. By all means, go for the shotgun, go for the Magnum, get some ammo and fill it up and do what you got to do. But as a melee DPS, just remember that it is very important that you prioritize the melee weapons over the ranged weapons. You're going to be naturally more resistant to being up close, especially if your fellow survivor, if Tyrone is in your group, knows what he's doing. So in this particular case, as I made the example of earlier, I actually didn't have enough money in this particular game to afford a sledgehammer. So this is what I'm saying about how it's expensive to be able to replace these things once they get broken. So repair kits are always going to be the higher priority. And since I had made the mistake of buying the shotgun at the beginning of this second stage, then I ended up not being able to afford what I actually needed later. Now, we still ended up coming out and winning this match. It's not that big of a deal, but this is just one of those things that you can kind of take that feedback from into your own playthroughs in the scenario and start to improve your own skills and not make the same mistakes that I did. Again, when you look at those priorities, that's ultimately what's going to bring you success in your team, is knowing exactly what the strengths are with your specific character and taking advantage of those to your utmost capability. So in this case, I ended up buying a bat since it was kind of a budget situation. And the steel bat is still decent, don't get me wrong. It actually swings a little bit faster than the sledgehammer does too. So you have a little bit of added benefit there. It's a little bit cheaper, it doesn't do quite as much damage, but the melee swings are a bit faster. You have some trade-offs, some caveats. So it really does come down to preference, that if hypothetically you weren't able to afford a sledgehammer, the steel bat is going to get the job done too. Again, though, if you have the option, always go for the sledgehammer. The sledgehammer is also pretty much an instant stagger for anything that it hits, including liquors and things like that. So you want to make sure that if you have the opportunity available, that you go ahead and take advantage of that and grab the sledgehammer and make sure you have enough repair kits. That way you don't have to make another trip to the item box and spend a considerable amount of resources replacing that. Now, ideally, you shouldn't be using the item box a second time once you start this process. You should be well stocked enough that when you start attacking these biocores, you don't have to make another trip to the item box for the remainder of the game. So when you add that up, it's really only 2 visits to the item box over the course of the entire match, provided that you do things correctly. That's going to be 1 at the beginning of the second part of the stage and once at the beginning of the third portion of the stage. So this is an example of a situation where Mr. X has created some discord in the run. So what we're doing here is we're trying to split up in a way that kind of distracts Mr. X and essentially wastes his time. When you're in a situation where Mr. X is chasing you, the only thing that you can do is waste his time. You can't kill him. You can't really, in a technicality standpoint, you can't really outrun him because he has that sprint. And so all you really have to do is just waste his time and try to find any way you can to get something done while he's out. I personally recommend traveling in pairs. You know, I've said it before in the previous videos that you really have two different options when it comes to navigating terrain. You can either travel as a group of 4 or you can travel in duos. I never recommend going off solo. Of course, these videos are, you know, just kind of one take runs that we've had victories in. So I'm not doing everything perfectly in these takes, of course, but the things that I've learned over the consistent victories that we've had as a group of survivors is that it's very important to travel in that manner, so that way if Mr. X does show up, you have the ability to scatter as a pair of 2 and still have one group being able to accomplish things while the other pair is wasting Mr. X's time, whether that be with grenades, Tyrone's kick, or however your group composition is formed in a way that makes sense and is agreeable with you and the rest of the team, of course. So at this phase, we've disabled all biocores. We're kind of just making our way towards the exit, and we are making our final stand to defeat the mastermind. Now, depending on the mastermind, sometimes they've already set up this area and it's more difficult to get into the switch to actually pull it and start the final countdown. However, in this case, it was pretty much wide open and we have all 4 survivors already here. Valerie has laid down her fever skill, enabling us to heal in the meantime, which if you guys have not watched the Valerie video, definitely check that out to get some tips and tricks on how to play her. But at this point, we're pretty much just waiting it out. I decided to activate my fever skill and start just going absolutely ham on this armored zombie. And with the combined efforts of our fellow survivors, we were able to hold off the armored zombie and the liquor, ultimately opening the door. And once everybody stacked up, we were able to finish the stage. So that is pretty much the rundown on how to play Samuel. And at the end of the day, like I said, I'm going to call him Chad because he absolutely has the highlights, the vocabulary, and the peanut-sized brain that is required to be classified as a Chad. In the next video, we'll be going over Tyrone and some of his abilities. In the meantime, I hope you guys have a wonderful time with Resident Evil 3. Have a fantastic weekend. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.